Welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. This week, I'd like to celebrate who I consider to be the best big bad expansion boss that we've had from WoW, Garrosh Hellscream. Now, right off the gate, we need to assess that statement. Who's his competition? Well, there's Kelthu frickin' Zod, who was perfectly respectable, but I don't think anyone would consider him the best. Vanilla raids were very disjointed from one another, so there wasn't a ton of build-up to him within WoW itself. Kil'jaeden was built up better, but really isn't that interesting of a character. He's simply the highest ranking Legion leader that we actually interact with, since we never really do that with Sargeras. He was also overshadowed in the Burning Crusade by Illidan, at least in terms of presence and aura. Halion was a pretty insignificant Twilight Dragon in the grand scheme of things. Oh, okay, fine. Arthas is a popular and perfectly valid choice. His Anakin-like fall from grace in Warcraft 3 is highly celebrated among fans as one of Warcraft's best character arcs. I would absolutely respect anyone who picked him, although I've always felt that he's a bit too beloved by the community. Deathwing had potential, but wound up being a very one-note antagonist. And funnily enough, Dragonflight kind of made him even more one-note. Archimonde is basically just blue Kil'jaeden, but without the intense bitterness towards Velen. Argus was a cool fight and design, but had no personality of his own, and was just a victim of the Legion's machinations. N'Zoth had a ton of build-up, which actually hurt him when he didn't live up to expectations, and dying to a laser beam didn't help. Zovaal. Yeah, Varrock would probably be my bronze medalist so far. He had a very basic personality of being the angry pyro, but that worked well for him and was refreshing, and we at least got to see him having interesting relationships with Eridikron and Viranoth. So it basically boils down to Arthas and Garrosh for most players. But why do I think Garrosh worked as well as he did? Well, it boils down to three major reasons. He felt grounded, he had a believable and well-paced arc, and he became what he did due to both his own personality and his circumstances. I should admit before proceeding that more so than other parts of the lore, the era surrounding Cataclysm is a bit of a blind spot for me. I was not super active in the game at the time, and there were a lot of story developments, many of which occurred outside of the game anyway, through novels and short stories, which are gaps that I've basically had to fill in using wiki articles. So first off, Garrosh was maybe WoW's most grounded antagonist. It's a fairly simple point in his favor. We are very used to final bosses being bombastically powerful beings. Newborn titans, old gods, humongous dragons, and eternal beings. Now, there isn't anything inherently wrong with antagonists on a large scale, assuming you don't go too big, but I prefer the other end of the spectrum. Garrosh was just a buff orc with lots of military resources. At his strongest, he was a bit roided up from the heart of Y'Shaarj, but that pales in comparison to pretty much every other end boss. The one end boss that could be considered weaker was Kelthu Zod, on account of him being a lich who, while a master spellcaster, was not super physically imposing. Garrosh's goals were similarly reined in. I think it's common knowledge at this point that the higher the stakes get, the less an audience cares. The end of reality just doesn't mean as much to us on a personal level as Garrosh wanting to reform the Horde to his own ideals. Secondly, he had a believable character trajectory that was perfectly paced. We met him in the Burning Crusade in 2006 and faced off against him in Mists of Pandaria in 2013. That was 7 years and 4 expansions for his arc to play out. And in fact, each expansion marked a different phase of his descent. In the Burning Crusade, he was stagnant and depressed, weighed down by the knowledge that his father had damned his people by consuming the blood of Mannoroth. It wasn't until Thrall shared with him the story of how Grom slew Mannoroth and liberated their people that Garrosh was able to crawl out of his lethargy and begin to act for the betterment of his people. In Wrath of the Lich King, he served as part of Thrall's council, though it was more of an attempt by Thrall to foster Garrosh's growth. During this period, Garrosh showed his brash and aggressive nature, viewing the Alliance as enemies to be crushed, not a force to be collaborated with. He was always willing to trade blows, provided it be done in a way that he deemed honorable. At any rate, Garrosh was able to really demonstrate his capabilities here, with the Scourge serving as an abundant target of his wrath. With Cataclysm, he was promoted to the rank of War Chief, and with this newfound authority, began to exhibit signs of totalitarianism. Anyone who heard Orc NPC's new clickable dialogue of "Hellscream's eyes are upon you" would immediately have alarm bells going off. Garrosh had his beliefs about what was right and what the Horde ought to be and do, being very proud of his orcish culture, and he wasn't shy about acting upon those beliefs. He surely felt a lot of pressure to live up to his new position, and thought that thorough action was the best way to fulfill his responsibilities, including securing scarce natural resources for the Horde. His disdain for the inferior practices of other races within the Horde began to surface more and more. He did not care for the passivity of the Tauren or the disgusting practices of the Forsaken. He increasingly disregarded dissenting voices and escalated his war effort against the Alliance. Over the course of Mists of Pandaria, Garrosh completed his journey into an absolute dictatorship, silencing all dissenting opinions and outright turning against the other Horde races that weren't orcs or completely subservient. He even went so far as to attempt having Vol'jin assassinated. At the same time, he began to utilize more drastic tactics, such as bombing Theramore and defiling the Veil of Eternal Blossoms to revitalize the heart of Y'Shaarj. Basically, his journey from TBC to MoP could be summed up as lethargy into ambition, into aggression, into escalation. And thereafter with WoD and Shadowlands, we see him just double down on his stances, as it can be extremely difficult to walk yourself back after a certain point. I understand that many feel Garrosh was villain-batted, and I don't think his character arc was portrayed perfectly, but on the whole, it makes sense to me. My main criticism was that it could be difficult to follow that arc due to so much of it being covered in external media. And thirdly, his fall from grace was due to a combination of both internal and external factors. As Thrall points out in their final Mak Gorah, Garrosh made his own choices, and it would be erroneous to absolve Garrosh for what he did. But, as Garrosh pointed out, Thrall made him who he was. Thrall wasn't entirely wrong to deny this, but he did play a part in it all. I think I've covered the internal factors pretty adequately already. Garrosh always had a prideful personality. Even his depression in TBC stemmed from his pride being wounded by his father's actions. His actions thereafter were almost always motivated by his pride as a warrior, as an orc, and as a conqueror. It is then fitting that the Shah we face in Siege of Orgrimmar is the Shah of Pride. As Emperor Shao House succinctly put it, pride is good until it is bad, and Garrosh's aggressive nature enabled his pride at every opportunity. But Garrosh was also failed by almost everyone who was supposed to support him and rein in his worst tendencies. Thrall had taken Garrosh under his wing and was quite clearly trying to groom him to be a great champion of the Horde. But when the Cataclysm happened, he had to step away from the Horde to act as the World Shaman. This was understandable, if unfortunate, for Garrosh, but Thrall's major mistake here was naming Garrosh as acting war chief instead of his first instinct of Cairn, who he knew would fill the role better. But he was too hesitant to break tradition and name a non-orc as war chief, a mistake that he would learn from, later advocating for Vol'jin to take the role. At any rate, Thrall settled on Garrosh, a decision which even Garrosh protested at first, pointing out that his role was on the battlefield and not in politics. Garrosh was right, at least at the time, but Thrall assured him that he would have the counsel needed for the job, and so Garrosh was pushed into a position he was ill-suited to occupy. Cairn was to serve as one of Garrosh's advisors, and he did do this at first, but that relationship quickly fell apart when an attempted negotiation between Tauren and Night Elves over access to Ashenvale's lumber was thwarted by Twilight's Hammer agents posing as Horde forces and killing the entire gathering aside from Hamel Runetotem, who believed the assailants aligned with Garrosh's views. This led to an argument between Cairn and Garrosh. Although Garrosh denied being behind the attack, he didn't exactly deny his warmongering attitude, saying he would have boasted about the attack instead of trying to hide it, spurring Cairn to challenge Mak Gorah, as he didn't believe Garrosh was fit to lead. Garrosh agreed, but insisted that it be to the death, to which Cairn consented. Garrosh won that fight, though Magatha's secret poisoning of Gorehowl throws into question the legitimacy of the outcome. Cairn likely did not handle the situation perfectly. He could have been less accusatory of Garrosh, or tried longer to steer the orc towards a more noble path before directly challenging his leadership, even if I applaud his willingness to actually do so. Vol'jin was also to advise Garrosh, but the two of them had a very tenuous relationship. Vol'jin saw Garrosh's thirst for war and continually voiced his disapproval. Eventually, he had enough of it, and Garrosh had enough of Vol'jin's words, causing a breakdown in relations. Garrosh expelled trolls from the heart of Orgrimmar, and Vol'jin threatened to one day kill Garrosh for where he was leading the horde. Like with Cairn, I like Vol'jin and think he was right to challenge Garrosh's actions, but he was probably a bit too swift and severe with his proclamation. It's hardly surprising that Garrosh grew more insular after having not only his position, but his very life threatened by his supposed advisor. Bane Bloodhoof was at first surprisingly cooperative with Garrosh, considering he had slain his father. The two coordinated to stop Magatha Grimtotem's forces. After Garrosh had insulted Bane for his inaction towards Quilboar attacks, he took a small force of Kor'kron to deal with the matter himself, only to be overwhelmed by their numbers. Bane actually came to the Warchief's rescue, but despite this obligation to his Warchief, Bane also voiced disapproval frequently and outright betrayed the Horde's military efforts when he warned Jaina Proudmoore of the impending attack on Theramore. On their own, the actions of these individuals may not seem like much, but when combined, you start to see a picture of Garrosh constantly having his actions called out and his authority and life threatened by those who are supposed to help him. None of this excuses Garrosh for what he did, but I do think it's worth noting that in the Meghar recruitment scenario, we are told by Anachronos that in countless potential timelines, he, Garrosh, was seen as a great hero to his people. Some called him the Horde's greatest war chief. What you saw here was one of his worst possible incarnations, a waste. Garrosh was a powder keg to be sure, but under ideal circumstances, his downfall may have been avoided, and I think that makes him a much more compelling character. So yeah, those are the main reasons I personally think Garrosh was WoW's best expansion villain. I do think it behooves me to address the comparison between him and Sylvanas. Most players agree that Sylvanas' BFA story was just a worse version of Garrosh's, but some might argue that it's hypocritical for me to applaud what they did with Garrosh while also complaining that Sylvanas was villain-batted. To this I say that while Sylvanas was always morally dubious, she never seemed to be operating in defiance of the rest of the Horde, like Garrosh did, until BFA. The only real exception to this was in defiance to Garrosh himself, though she was hardly alone in this regard. She was kind of a bad girl, but she was our bad girl. And there's a very clear difference between gradually making Garrosh a villain over 7 years with clear warning signs along the way, and very abruptly making Sylvanas a villain after she'd already been part of the Horde for 14 years and everyone was comfortable with her. But that's enough about Sylvanas, this is not her video. Believe me, that will be coming in the future. And surprise, surprise, for this week's drawing, I went with Garrosh Hellscream. I've already covered most of my thoughts on his character. I think he was incredibly well written, and appreciate that unlike a lot of the current leadership, he at least always had the Horde's best interest in mind, even if he had very warped ideas of what those best interests were. All that being said though, I value him way more as a villain than as a hero of the Horde. And I don't really agree with players who think we should have kept him as Warchief, even if those players are talking about a pre-mop version of him. And I think a lot of players focus too much on that one quest line in Stone Talon Mountains, which we know from interviews was an outlier because of a lack of internal communication. Since I had already drawn Gorehowl with his father Garrosh Hellscream, or at least the AU version of Garrosh, I instead drew Garrosh with Zalatow, the desecrated image of Gorehowl. This is the axe that he wields during Siege of Orgrimmar, having discarded Gorehowl itself. And I don't think there's any real lore on this thing. Despite looking extremely similar to Gorehowl, we know for a fact that it is not the same weapon. It's just more of a symbolic replacement. And yes, the name is very similar to Xal'atath. More than likely, we can just chalk this up to them both being references to Xel'lotath, one of the 3 ancients from the GameCube game Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. A very Lovecraftian game that of course would be used for Old Gods material. And for the background, I put him next to his throne in the Underhold in the Siege of Orgrimmar. I know Siege of Orgrimmar gets a ton of praise, and I agree with a lot of that praise, but I also have some major misgivings with how they designed the raid. I think most people agree that it was way too linear, with the only actual choice being if you want to face Siegecrafter Blackfuse after Malkorak, after Spoils of Pandaria, or after Thok. That is way too little choice for a 14 boss raid. I also would have just chopped off the first 4 bosses and thrown them into their own separate raid, because I hate when dungeons and raids change locations and make it more about the event than the location. And then you could just have the 2 raids released concurrently. I think it's a bit of a shame that WoW just doesn't do that anymore. And I also just wasn't a huge fan of how bosses 5 through 8 reuse Orgrimmar as a setting. I would have stuffed everything into the Underhold and expanded that. And since that would mean the raid actually starts around where Ragefire Chasm is, I would just stick the raid entrance right there and force Alliance players to fly into the heart of Orgrimmar to participate. Because why not? It would be hilarious. Or I guess they could just do what they did with Battle of Dazar'alor and have separate entrances for each faction, if you want to be boring about it. But I don't mean to nitpick too much. The raid itself had very fun encounters, gave me some very good memories, and had a very satisfying conclusion. And speaking of conclusions, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!